All right, thanks for the opportunity to speak here. Sandwiched in between two excellent speakers, Kim Hill and Marco. It's an honor to get this spot. I will start the talk where my career started with these two fine people, Martin Daly and the late, great Margot Wilson. If you had the difficult task of trying to sum up their whole scientific body of work in 4 words, you might come up with those 4 words: who kills and why. Go read Homicide. It's a classic book on this topic, and Martin's new book on the topic is excellent. Their success at applying evolutionary ideas to an obviously very, very important question, lays the groundwork for all of us to do evolutionarily informed social science, kind of validates proof of concept that yes, evolutionary thinking has a lot to offer on very, very important questions. The way they always approached the question, Martin still talks about it this way, is they say that their study of homicide is kind of a tip of the iceberg assay of broader phenomena of social conflict. Homicide is an extreme and very noteworthy manifestation of social conflict. In some ways, it's easier to measure and more scientifically tractable, just for example, because governments keep better data on homicides than, say, assaults. You can kind of brush assaults under the rug. Nobody reports a lot of assaults, but if there's a dead body, you got to count it. So homicide, approaching the study of homicide is always, that's just one way to look at a broader phenomenon that is social conflict. And a lot of the ideas, theories, approaches to take in the study of homicide apply more broadly. The way I'm going to approach this is I even think homicide is the tip of maybe an even bigger iceberg that, I would say that the question of who kills and why you can think of as a subset of a broader question, who takes risks and why. And I think that's a very important question, both because it encompasses that stuff and it encompasses lots of other forms of social conflict. And I'll even get into arguing that this question goes into non-social type of decisions as well. So here's what the talk will be. I'm going to start with kind of a broad review of how the social sciences approach the question of individual differences in risk-taking, how they approach the question of origins of risk. And I'll present kind of a fuzzy verbal model that has the power of explaining a lot of the broad trends that I will review, that it adds some evolutionary intuition to kind of social psychology thinking. That's where the verbal model is aimed at, an audience of social psychologists. Then I'll talk about how to take the fuzzy verbal model and formalize it into an actual math model. So last week, Kim Hill was in here saying evolutionary psychologists don't do enough math modeling. Kim Hill, we do it. And so I will present, at least some of us are trying. Then I'll get into a case study of applying this type of thinking to a different topic, work I've done here with Dan and Colin on the topic of disgust, looking at disgust through a risk-centric lens. If I have time, I'll get into another case study in thinking about prisoner's dilemma defection through this risk lens. So the first part, the review and verbal model, is from a paper I did with these two fine bald gentlemen. My PhD advisor, Pat Barkley, and Sandeep Mishra. Again, this is pitched at a social psychology audience, but I'll review it for you guys because I think it's useful to think about how the broader behavioral sciences world is thinking about risk and what evolution has to offer broadly, and then we'll get more into the specifics. So start with a very kind of simplistic definition of risk, a very, very broad definition of risk. It's a definition that, at least in a formal sense, a lot of disciplines are converging on, and it's just the statistical concept of variance. And a decision that has more outcome variance than another one is a riskier decision. So you can think about that in some kind of asocial context, maybe foraging. You have maybe a plant-based foraging strategy has a low caloric variance associated with it, and maybe a large game foraging strategy has high variance associated with it. Or you could think, you can start to think into the social realm, and if you need a car, one way to obtain a car is to steal a car, and maybe you get the benefit of free car, that's a big benefit, but then maybe you get the punishment associated with theft, that's a big cost. In contrast, you go to the dealer, you negotiate what seems like a fair, mutually beneficial price. Maybe you get a little bit better car, a little bit worse car than you thought you bargained for, but it's a lower variance pursuit. This, again, while a lot of disciplines are converging on this thinking, or on this in a formal sense, a lot of the way risk gets discussed, both just colloquially and kind of the way a lot of social scientists seems to be reasoning about it, really focuses on deviant type risks. Things we don't like are the risky things that are self-defeating. There's a little tone of pejorativeness that kind of seeps into this thinking a lot of the time. And this is problematic if we recognize that there are situations, there are circumstances in which risk-taking is adaptive, it's rational, it makes sense. And so if you dig into the behavioral ecology, foraging type literature, if you're a bird and you're near starvation, you ought to upregulate your risk-taking. You ought to be willing to expose yourself to the potential for predation, because otherwise you're going to die otherwise when you run out of energy reserves. In contrast, if you're fat and you got a full belly, you don't need to take risks. So there are situations where risk-taking is is seemingly adaptive, and just thinking in terms of a purely negative idea of risk-taking, you're going to miss some of this if you're not thinking about it this way. So to formalize this risk sensitivity theory idea, if we're at some kind of present state, we need to get to a goal desired state, like not starving. You've got two options that both on average are going to get you halfway there, but if one of them has a lot of outcome variance associated with it and the other has low variance, again, you pick the higher variance outcome because you have a chance of meeting your goal. There's no reason to take the low variance one because you can't reach your goal that way. In contrast, if your goal is set a lot lower, if there's less disparity between your desired state and your current state, now there's absolutely no reason to take the high-risk choice. The low-risk choice guarantees you that you're going to move up beyond your goal threshold. There's no reason to expose yourself to the outcome variance. So risk sensitivity theory is about facultatively adjusting your risk preference as a function of a need or a disparity between a current state and a goal state. Okay, so zooming back out to the big question, who takes risks and why, the question of individual differences in risk-taking, kind of the traditional widespread behavioral science approach, it's kind of an economics type approach, is to think that individual agents have some kind of risk preference function and it's a stable property of me, of an individual, and confronted with a risk scenario in any domain, I consult my own risk preference and I decide accordingly. That's kind of the traditional model. It's influential, and it's not a bad model actually. So a lot of phenomena that are thought of as or at least thought of as stable individual traits, things like sensation-seeking, impulsivity, low self-control, these putative, stable individual difference traits are fairly reliably associated with a wide variety of risky behaviors, lending credence to the idea that some kind of stable trait is producing risky behaviors, some kind of risk function. And a lot of supporting evidence from this comes from this so-called generality of deviance framework. Sometimes generality of deviance is offered as if it were a hypothesis, but really it's a description of a phenomenon, which is that a person who engages in one deviant behavior tends to also engage in other deviant behaviors. If you're driving recklessly and taking illegal drugs, you're probably more inclined towards violence in your interpersonal disputes, these kinds of things. Criminals tend to be criminal generalists, not specialists. Even if there's some stereotype of, a bank heist specialist or something, criminals tend to be generalists. So there's a great deal of evidence that within individuals, deviant type risk-taking behaviors very much do cluster. And so that seems to fit with this idea of a stable risk function that manifests in a domain general way. The problem for this is people, and again, we're still kind of out in broad social science land. People are starting to realize, wait, if we consider other forms of risk-taking, non-deviant forms of risk-taking, now we do start to see that people seem to exhibit high levels of risk-taking in some domains, but not others. So, for example, there's people that take high levels of recreational sports-type risk-taking, call them Fessler types. But Fessler types, they don't tend to be wild with their finances. I have no idea. I have no idea if that's true. Or the generality of deviance type people, they're not firefighters. So recognizing that, if you start to consider non-deviant forms, risk-taking behavior does seem to vary. And so then there's this emerging thing, this risk-return framework. Starts to sound a little bit more like functional thinking, like evolutionary-minded people would. The idea here is people estimate the costs and benefits of risk-taking in any given domain, and based on their estimates of what the costs and benefits are, they engage in risk-taking if it's profitable, and they don't if it isn't profitable. And you can ask people what they perceive the costs and benefits of any risky behavior to be, and then ask them how often they do that kind of thing, and their perceptions do seem to vary with their actual self-reported behavior, lending some credence to this more domain-specific type of risk-taking idea. The problem with this, or a problem with this, a great deal of this type of literature is based on the administration of a scale instrument called the DOSPERT, the Domain-Specific Risk-Taking Scale. And this is kind of a slur of a whole bunch of risky type activities. It's parsed into domains. The domains are things like financial risk-taking, recreational risk-taking, ethical risk-taking. They're kind of folk categories into which you might imagine that risk-taking domains separate out into, but they're not really, carving nature at the joints type domains like you would want to take if you're thinking about this in an evolutionary system. So people are starting to work at a modified DOSPERT type instrument based on a more evolutionarily informed idea of what constitutes domains, where costs and benefits come from. So that's a promising future direction for this type of work. But again, a challenge for the risk-return framework is it's not anchored in any kind of functional theory, but clearly it has potential to go in that direction. So again, zooming back out to this question, what are the origins of risk-taking? How are we going to explain who takes risks and why? To put this all together, you need to be able to account for this appearance of domain generality and reasonable evidence and reasonable theorizing that points in a direction of thinking of risk in a domain general way, but you also need to be able to account for this appearance of domain specificity and the theories and evidence that look like that. Furthermore, presumably, if you're going to get into individual differences in risk, you want to look at how the risky behaviors relate to individual trait-type things about the individual, things like personality traits. I'll focus in a minute a lot on embodied capital or some other type of quality measure. And then you want to always situate the individual within a situation, within an environment in which they find themselves. So, in the homicide work that Martin and Margot did that I opened with alluding to, income inequality is a fantastic predictor of variation in homicide rates across jurisdictions of various sizes, probably related to the intensity of local competition. So you want to be able to account for these type of influences as well. So the proposal is, and again, this is a verbal model meant to guide intuitions, is to think about two pathways to risk, not intended to be independent pathways, but you kind of conceptually a different thought process. One, and we'll get more into the details, one is a need-based risky scenario. It's the I'm starving, gotta upregulate my risk-taking type of scenario. And then the other is an ability-based scenario. I have some special privilege advantage that confers some advantage. It's kind of this costs and benefits specified to to some specific abilities that I have. So we'll get into these details now. So again, need-based risk-taking, it's based on risk sensitivity theory. It's based on actors shifting towards risk preference as a need or a disparity grows. So bodies of evidence that seem consistent, that the need-based framework helps you to think about. So within the antisocial risk-taking realm, the Daly and Wilson idea of a young male syndrome, you can start with looking at the demographics of homicides in any group, in any time in history, and what do you see? You basically see that homicide is a young men's game. Basically everywhere, it's the young men that are doing the vast bulk of the killing. This can be explained by, young human men are going through the life history stage associated with the most intense levels of competition for reproductive access. There's a whole body of theory that very much is a need-based story about why we see these kinds of demographic patterns with homicide and lots of other forms of risk-taking being concentrated in young men. I put the little asterisk there because it's not necessarily about youth. Because, for example, older men who are widowed or who are divorced, they kind of snap back to the homicidal levels of their youthful counterparts. Lose your job, lose your wife, these kinds of things tend to lead to reverting back to young male levels of risk-taking. But all of this very much seems like situational competition, typically concentrated in youth, but possible at later life stages. Whoops. So that's one life course pattern of antisocial behavior, the early life delinquency followed by early adulthood, steady decline in risk-taking. There is another pattern of delinquency called life course persistent offending, the people that are just bad their whole lives. A lot of these cases look like people who face persistent disadvantages. A lot of them had early life developmental trauma, head injuries, things like this. They're just constantly at a disadvantage or low IQ, low embodied capital, they're losers of the genetic lottery or something such that they're just chronically in a situation of disadvantage, chronically escalating the risk-taking to try to make the best of their bad situation. Need-based risk-taking in non-antisocial scenarios, well known and well understood in finance that people adjust the levels of risk acceptance to the monetary goal. I need this much money for retirement. I adjust the riskiness of my portfolio accordingly. Very overt, very thought out. Sports is modern coalitional conflict. Professional sports is very high stakes modern coalitional conflict. Popular strategizing about sports has the idea that certain scenarios favor escalating your risky athletic tactics. So if you actually do analysis of how American football teams decide on risky passing plays versus safe running plays, they do the riskier plays under exactly the situations of high disparity where you would expect to see escalated risk-taking. So very high stakes modern coalitional conflict is very need-based risk, takes account of need-based risk-taking in their strategic decisions. Okay. Ability-based risk-taking, this is thinking again about risk as some privilege or as, you can pull off the risk better than other people somehow. You can engage in the behavior more profitably. If you fail, you have more of a buffer somehow, these kinds of advantages. The logic of costly signaling is very similar to this ability-based risk-taking logic. Ability-based risk-taking in the antisocial realm, so take Aaron Sell's work on fighting and anger, and the logic here is that muscular men with good upper body strength are going to be better and more likely to win at fighting, and thus more likely to use the risky tactic that is fighting or threatening violence in their bargaining strategies. So ability-based risk-taking, willingness to fight as a function of how strong you are. Kind of ties in with work that Dan and Colin have done on what they call the crazy bastard hypothesis, that by conspicuously taking risks, People are going to be afraid to go against you. They're going to want you on their side when coalitional conflict goes down. Or when conflict happens, you don't want to be lined up against the crazy bastard. You want to be lined up with the crazy bastard. And then in the non-antisocial risk-taking realm, there's work showing, successful risk takers are more attractive. A lot of work on pro-social risk-taking is signaling that I reviewed in a book chapter. A lot of us in this room did a seminar discussion recently about classic work where, among the island-dwelling Miriam people, some young men engage in the extremely risky behavior of going out on the open ocean, jumping into the water and wrestling like a 200-pound turtle to provision at a feast. So they're taking an immense risk. There's a very pro-social outcome. They're going to feed it to a feast. Some people do it and some people don't, and it seems like the higher quality people are the ones that are taking this risk. So how do we put all that together into one model that accommodates these two, there's fuzzy logic to it, but it seems a little bit like we're telling two different stories. One seems like a story of high quality people doing the risk taking. One seems like a story of low quality people doing the risk taking. How do we resolve these two intuitions? And what we are thinking, you find yourself in a situation of competitive advantage or disadvantage that's going to be some kind of product of one's absolute state. I have, I'm so tall and I have so much musculature and I have the allies that I have, I have an absolute state. But this is embedded in an environment. My competitors are of a certain quality. My environment has certain resources in it. Putting this all together, here's what we have come up with. We're calling it the relative state model. So, there are sources of human capital in, say, gene expression, developmental environment. These kind of interact to create an absolute state that is some function of embodied capital and situational environmental factors. All of that interacts in crazy ways. There's all kinds of feedback loops between all of this. But it all kind of filters into this idea of like a situation-specific relative state where you have an advantage or disadvantage. And so in any given decision context assuming that you can just take a binary risk, there's a probability of success and failure, there's an expected value to you of your success or failure, and so presumably decision-making is some kind of function of the probabilities and the expected values. So what does this model do for you? I think that the best thing that this model does is resolve this appearance of domain generality and domain specificity that I talked about. And the key here is that across these multiple contexts, some of these contexts are going to have strong correlation between these costs and benefit streams. Some of the contexts are going to have very different structured costs and benefits, and these are going to give rise to the appearance of domain specificity or not. So, relative state is feeding into decision making in different contexts. If context 1 and context 2, this stuff is very different, it's very not equal, that's when you're going to expect that the behavioral outputs, no reason to expect they're correlated, and it's going to look like domain specificity. But then you start to think about context where there's, approximate equality between the cost and benefit streams across these contexts, and the decision-making in terms of the risk profile coming out of all of these contexts is going to look more like a domain general pattern of behavior. So, imagine this is financial risk-taking, and maybe most of what's relevant to that is your financial resources and your knowledge of markets or something like that. Whereas, fighting and turtle hunting both involve strength and agility, and thus you expect some kind of overlap. That's what we think is the power of these two, integrating these two pathways into one big kind of fuzzy model. So some key takeaways from this model, again, pitching this to a general social psych audience. Fitness is relative, so we ought to be thinking about mechanisms that do consider relative position, not that are just purely anchored against some kind of absolute thing. I just talked about this. The model helps to reconcile these disparate patterns in the domain generality specificity, But also, this can neatly account for the antisocial, non-antisocial stuff, and thinking about a need-based pathway and an ability-based pathway. We've got the embodied and situational considerations, and this is just very broadly relevant to lots of social phenomena, cooperation, conflict, and mating, because almost any decision involves outcome variance, and so this way of thinking about it, we think, is going to be helpful. So, again, like I said, this is a verbal model. It's meant to to provide some intuition. So before I get into the case studies, I'll talk about how we can formalize it into a math model. So when I said earlier that Kim Hill was lamenting the lack of formal modeling, why do we want formal models? Well, again, the verbal models are fuzzy. When you present a concept in verbal form and somebody else presents another concept, you're never quite sure if you're talking about the same thing or not. It's difficult to be precise in verbal language, and math is kind of a universal and precise language, so there's some advantages there. But also, I put up 4 things and then arrows in all of the directions. When you're doing verbal reasoning, keeping track of how all the parts relate to each other starts to get tough, but math and equations are good at keeping track of all of these moving variables. So sometimes the math reveals things that you wouldn't have thought just purely based on kind of the simpler verbal reasoning type things. So I'm not going to try to really dig into the math, but I want to give you a flavor for how this will work and what we think of as the potential of this approach. Okay, our decision variable is X, the proportions of times that an agent engages in the risk-taking, so that's your decision variable. We've got expected payoffs such that the biggest payoff is if you're successful at the risk, the worst payoff is if you fail at the risk, and there's an intermediate payoff for just sitting it out entirely. No, I'm not going to take this risk. And then there's a probability of success. You can put it all into an equation like that, and there you get a fitness equation. So then with your fitness equation, then you can then ask, okay, how does risk-taking impact fitness? So you take the derivative of fitness with respect to risk-taking, you get this equation, and then you think, okay, well, if my payoffs are somehow based on quality, that's what the ability-based and risk-taking intuition is about, sometimes high-quality risk-takers, sometimes low-quality risk-takers. You take the derivative of this with respect to quality, and then you've got a big, long, complicated equation. But what you can do now is you can start plugging assumptions into the equation and start probing it. Examples of assumptions that you can plug in. For simplicity, let's assume that quality has linear effects on some of our key parameters. So the absolute lowest quality people have some baseline probability of succeeding, and then the probability of success of the risk-taking scales linearly with quality. Make a similar assumption for the other parameters. The payoff to success scales linear with quality. The payoff from failure scales linear with quality. The intuition there, again, is buffering. If I've got larger fat reserves, I'm buffered against starvation. That payoff to success, you might think of that like the fighting analogy would be a good one there. As your strength, as quality-related strength increases, you're more likely to win the fight. That would be an example where the payoff, actually no, that's likelihood of success. Better payoff from success. If you're already a popular politician, you give a shitty speech, or you give a good speech, maybe it rockets you more up in the popularity than somebody who didn't already have the popularity. The human capital in that way might be such a scenario. And then, the better trajectory, this idea is some people, if they sit it out, they're already on some kind of good trajectory. They've got more to lose than other people. By taking the risk, they lose the trajectory that they were already on. So this is some of the intuitions that would go along with adjusting each of the parameters based on quality. So you plug all of that into the big equation, and then you start to probe the equation and see which combination of parameters yield ability-based risk-taking that scales with ability or that scales upward with quality. I'm about to put up whole massive wall of text that I don't want you to try to take in, but just to give you an example of what this yields. So, one set of parameters is this set. This is a set of parameters where you expect high quality individuals to take risks. You can probe this and come up with some kind of intuition of what it means. Again, don't try to engage with this right now. It's going to take a while, but basically, if we plug in those linear parameters into the model as I described, and you can plug in different, you can scale quadratic or anything else. You don't have to plug in linear, but if we plug in those linear assumptions, we get 8 different sets of parameters like this. This is one of 8 sets of parameters. And what we find is that 3 of the parameter combinations look exactly like ability-based risk-taking. The high-quality people are selected to do more risk-taking. 3 of the combinations of parameters look very much like need-based risk-taking. The low-quality people are selected to do the risk-taking. 1 favors only the extremes, either like both the high and the lowest quality. So all of those are consistent with the verbal logic of our verbal model of ability or need-based risk-taking. But the math did reveal one, and it's an obscure combination. It's the most restrictive combination of the variables out there, but one where you expect selection on only the intermediate quality individuals taking the risks, but the highest and the lowest quality people don't. So here is a story of math revealing something that the intuitions didn't get to, that you might expect these kinds of situations. So this is the kind of work that the verbal model can do. What do you do with that? Well, this is all kind of a phenotypic gambit. It's just like, what should selection select for? Then you can go looking for mechanisms that recognize and respond to the key parameters in your system. And I think this is what Kim Hill was trying to encourage us to do last week. For those of you who weren't here, he presented like very rich data, for example, on foraging returns. So lots of people, you measure, they go out every day, how many calories do they come back with? Got very rich data on the variance. Then he speculated about need thresholds. A full-grown adult takes so long to starve, a young child takes so long to starve. I think the idea is that you start to take some of this human behavioral ecology data and see what natural systems the parameters align, and then see if the psychology matches the model's prediction of how all the parameters fit together. I think that this is where this kind of work would go. But I'll be very curious to hear your guys' feedback about the math model, because this is where we're at with it right now. We've done the math, we've got all these parameters, and now we're thinking about what to do with them. Okay, I think that's all I've got on the math model. Yes, okay. So next topic is applying this type of thinking towards studying the emotion of disgust, is thinking about disgust through outcome variance lens and predicting individual differences in the emotion of disgust using this kind of framework. So another couple of bald guys that I've been working with on this, plus some collaborators from India. So disgust is nice for this, because I started by saying, I start by thinking about this in the social realm. I mostly worked on the psychology of cooperation and conflict, but I think that these risk ideas can even expand outside of the social realm. And disgust is implicated in behaviors related to pathogen avoidance. Disgust is implicated in sexual behaviors. Disgust is implicated in moral phenomena. So looking at disgust as a mechanism in this framework is a nice way to kind of sample how does the framework apply across a wide domain, like a wide different domains of behavior. So let's just take a second and think about how disgust in each of those domains, what kind of behavior does it motivate? So pathogen disgust. I've got a sandwich and I drop it on the floor, and not just on the floor, but it scatters, and I've got to put it all back together. Do I eat it? Presumably disgust motivates not eating it, and not feeling disgust may lead to eating it. And eating a potentially contaminated food item, well, you might get the calories and there's a benefit, but you also might get sick, and that can be a pretty good cost. That's a lot of outcome variance. Simply not eating it is a lower variance decision. No calories, no illness. So disgust motivates risk aversion in the pathogen avoidance realm. Sexual disgust. Pursuing any given sexual opportunity is riskier than not pursuing it. Sex comes with the potentially ultimate benefits of reproduction and the proximate benefits that go along with that, but there are potential costs. Disease is, again, a cost of sexual behavior. Sexual violence is a thing that happens with humans. In other animal species, sexual violence is obligate. And then, especially for women, like a suboptimal mating is a huge opportunity cost of fitness. I say especially for women because women have lower lifetime total reproduction, so any given reproductive episode is a larger portion of her total lifetime output, so the potential opportunity costs of suboptimal mating are something else to consider. So any given sexual pursuit is riskier than not. Sexual disgust motivates risk aversion in the realm of sexual decision making. Moral disgust is complicated. I'm not going to be able to do it full justice in this talk, but to give a flavor of that kind of thinking, if moral disgust motivates you to distance yourself from an actor who is morally questionable or morally objectionable, you're giving up some benefits that you can be friends with. Traditionally prostitutes are traditionally morally scorned. You can be friends with prostitutes, and maybe maybe some of them are good friends that have lots of benefits. But if you get caught up in the condemnation by association, there are potentially large costs. So maybe moral disgust has a clear risk-taking differentiation. It's not as obvious, but take this perspective that, generally speaking, disgust motivates risk-averse patterns of behavior in a few realms. One clear implication, we think, of this is that you should expect sex differences in manifestations of disgust. And this would offer the opportunity to explain why. We know that there are robust sex differences in a variety of risky behaviors. I've alluded to homicide as one of them earlier. And these kinds of sex differences have a very well-developed theoretical framework associated with them. Ancestral conditions of effective polygyny select for risk-taking males. And risk-taking not just behaviorally, but even somatic decisions like growth of musculature and stuff are arguably riskier. Yeah, like. Potential. I totally meant potential. Yeah. Just to support the point that the opportunity costs of suboptimal reproduction are higher for women than men. So we expect sex differences in disgust propensity following right along with this logic. The literature on disgust has lots of scattered reports of these sex differences, women being more disgust prone than men, but nobody had systematically analyzed the available literature to see whether that's true. So we did a big meta-analysis, skip over the details, lots of papers, lots of effects. Every different measure that we looked at showed a positive effect, meaning heightened female disgust propensity compared to male disgust propensity. To zoom in on the Tiber disgust measures, where it's differentiated kind of in evolutionarily informed domains, the sex effect is huge, way bigger than the rest. The pathogen kind of tags along with roughly the average effect size. The morality is the smallest one, but moral disgust seems to show the same sex differences as all the other forms of disgust, albeit perhaps smaller, but still robust and significant. This is just to illustrate that publication bias doesn't explain this effect. Nobody's differentially publishing disgust papers based on whether or not they got a sex effect, so there's no real reason to expect a file grower anyway, but this funnel plot is very symmetrical, with the exception of the triangles, which are the sex effects, which you would kind of expect, the sexual disgust effects, which you expect to be different anyway. So this is just a visual tool for, are we concerned that publication bias accounts for this effect? No, we are not concerned that this is about publication bias. So, you know, having now confirmed that indeed the empirical record does show large, robust sex differences in disgust, what are the explanations? Let's dig in a little bit deeper. The sexual disgust effect really looks like a pattern that I think we're all familiar with, wherein the sex that has greater obligate investment is generally going to be more choosy. Sexual disgust seems like a mechanism of sexual choosiness, so it's not terribly surprising that you see a big sex difference here. Other authors have offered this explanation for sex differences in this area, and we're on board with this explanation. We think it's a fine explanation. But getting into pathogen disgust, the explanations that are out there that have been previously offered, here we think that the existing explanations are lacking. So one hypothesis for the sex difference in pathogen disgust is based on this idea that women, and girls for that matter, are disproportionately to men and boys, are the ones that have to take care of immature kin. And so the costs of behavioral prophylaxis, the costs of not eating the floor sandwich, are offset by the benefits of, inclusive fitness benefits from not getting the young and sick. Problem with this, and lots of authors have put this forward, Dan has advocated for this hypothesis in the past, you might expect then that the system would adjust disgust as a function of whether or not you actually are a caregiver. And people have looked to see if this is the case, and maybe some of the methods aren't great, but there's no evidence that there is this facultative adjustment. And if anything, it looks like mothers are less disgust prone than non-mothers. So, reasonable sounding hypothesis, but the evidence doesn't really look to support it, and you might expect that maybe you want the offspring to be exposed to the local pathogen ecology. That might actually be a valuable thing. So problems with that hypothesis. There's a kind of related hypothesis. It also focuses on offspring, but at an earlier developmental stage. Pregnant women have compromised immune systems. Fetuses are foreign, and so you downregulate mom's immune system so that it accommodates the foreign, the foreign invader. So then the idea is, okay, downregulated immune system, I've got to upregulate my behavioral prophylaxis. My immune system can't handle pathogens right now, so be extra careful. The problem with this hypothesis is that we've got evidence that there are cyclical changes across the menstrual cycle in disgust levels. So if the system can adjust over a few weeks, why can't it adjust for the critical moments of pregnancy? Why are we getting this overall level of costly prophylaxis all the time? Or what appears to be all the time, what is likely all the time? Why are women consistently more disgust prone than men? So, we think the answer is just simply to situate this phenomenon among a long list of other sexual dimorphisms that are attributable to the variance in the mating system. Because the biggest winners in male reproductive competition are so much more successful than the biggest losers, you expect a system whereby men value opportunities more highly, are relatively indifferent to cost, are the bigger risk takers. So we see the sex difference in disgust as just tagging right along with that, a long list of behaviors and growths that respond to that selection pressure. And moral disgust is complicated. I don't think I can quite do it justice, but I will just say I happen to have observed, I didn't go looking for this, but how harshly do you condemn theft? Women condemn theft more harshly than do men. Same with deception. I've bumped into this before. So you can imagine that there are genuine sex differences in moral phenomenon that would be susceptible to these kinds of thinking. Maybe women are on average more vulnerable to theft than men, less likely to use theft themselves, and thus less likely to condemn it. These, again, morality is a complicated topic that we're not going to be able to do justice to in this time frame. Okay, so there are sex differences. We think that, you know, some broad perspective on what risk-taking means helps to clarify where to look for the explanations. Don't go looking for the narrow mechanistic explanations in this case. Think broader. Sex is just one way to group the costs and benefits among people. You know, sex is a nice little biological box that you can put people in. But there are other sources of embodied capital, situations that people find themselves in that might also contribute to variation in risk-taking, and specifically to variation in disgust. So the next prediction from this perspective is, if you look at a whole bunch of risky behaviors, on average you expect correlations between them, because on average there are some common inputs to the cost and benefit stream. We do expect to see some domain differentiated, some domain differentiation, but on average you take a big old blend of things and you expect any one given risky phenomena to be at least loosely correlated with the rest. So leveraging that assumption, you can ask the question is, do these various manifestations of disgust, do they co-vary with other self-reported risky, engagement in risky behavior? So I just covered this. And so, the people who are afraid of pathogens are the people who are risk-averse in a lot of other domains, is the general prediction here, and it's a fairly simple empirical question to go after. Big sample MTurk study, do a disgust measure that samples all these 3 domains of disgust, do a very broad risk measure, this domain-specific risk-taking scale that I talked about. Even if we're not thrilled with the way they carve up domains, it is a whole bunch of different risky things, so you're kind of sampling from the whole risk package. And we throw in a narrower risk measure. So, if risk is just outcome variance, there's one kind of risk is like entering a lottery. You accept a small cost for its potential huge gain. Another category, subset of risk-taking would be harm avoidance, where you take a small guaranteed loss to avert a much larger loss, so buying insurance. Disgust is more like buying insurance, so we kind of threw in a few extra items that are more in the harm avoidancy type of things. Do you wear a seatbelt? This kind of stuff, to see if disgust is differentially more like harm avoidance than the other forms of risk-taking. So we did that in study 1. Then we did a replication of study 1. It was pre-registered. We added an extra measure of disgust. This one, it uses visual stimuli, like what looks like a rag with like blood and pus on it. How disgusting do you find this? This other measure is just descriptive, text-based. And then we kind of expanded and thought a little more carefully about the harm avoidance scale the second time around. So we're looking for negative correlations between disgust and risk-taking. We think disgust is risk-averse, so we're looking for negative correlations. If you just take the index of all 3 disgust domains and compare it to the index of all the risk-taking, we got the exact same effect size in the 2 studies. For social science, this is almost a large effect. It's kind of a medium-ish to large effect. Very clear relationship between disgust propensity in the broad sense and risk-taking in the broad sense. If you break out the disgust domains, the directionality is the same in all of them. That extra pathogen measure, it's small, but it's still quite statistically significant, and it looks like all the rest of it. So this looks to us like, yeah, risk-taking and disgust do seem to be part of the same kind of broad package. On the harm avoidance side here, we're expecting positive correlations. We kind of went in thinking that these correlations would be bigger than the other. That prediction maybe sort of failed. It probably did fail, but they certainly go along with all the others. The effects were a bit bigger the second time around, but Harm avoidance items, again, these were things like, do you wear a seatbelt? Do you, will you take a longer route home if you can avoid an unsafe neighborhood? These were the kinds of things that were in there. So yeah, it seems like the individual level correlations are exactly what you would expect from this disgust as motivating domain-specific risk aversion type of an idea. So, to start with, we think that these ideas about, born from a broad view of risk-taking can be very usefully applied to the topic of disgust. It hits multiple domains of behavior, including even kind of asocial behavior, eating floor sandwiches. I don't have this bullet point up there, but we think this generalizes to a lot of other emotions too. So disgust is one emotion that motivates harm avoidance. There are other feelings that are associated with harm avoidance. So fear is a harm avoidance thing. Pain is a harm avoidance thing. Maybe the willies is a harm avoidance thing. So there's probably a lot of harm avoidant emotions where you make all of the same predictions here. And so we think that those kinds of investigations would be very likely to be fruitful. And then there's probably opposite emotions too, like anger, sexual arousal maybe, that these are risk-accepting emotions or feelings, and all of kind of the opposite patterns ought to apply. So just this broad swath of kind of affect, we think that similar things ought to be going on there. As to the system architecture that actually executes this functional logic, this is still an open question. Like, you could imagine some kind of centralized risk preference mechanism that, system-wide domain-specific systems kind of plug into some kind of central risk preference that weighs the costs and benefits that the system reports to it. You could imagine that architecture executing this. Or you can imagine that the different disgust mechanisms and the different other emotion mechanisms, that they've all separately been exposed to the same selection pressure, and so they all evolve their own risk preference mechanism, like on their own. That's an open question, but it seems like an interesting type of follow-up question. Okay, I have one more study that I could go through. Do I have time to? Yeah. Okay, I'll kind of zip through this one. This is an older one. There's some design flaws, but I like the idea, and maybe we can all think of some follow-up studies. So there's a simple idea here. The idea is that economic games, these weird things that we do with participants in the lab, that probably what's happening is people come into a lab and it's an unfamiliar decision scenario, but it looks like similar scenarios they've encountered in real life. So when presented with a prisoner's dilemma game, well, we consult our real life experience, and we've learned that screwing somebody over, defecting on somebody, is on average riskier than not. And so coming into the lab, by our way of thinking, we've already got some schema that defection is a riskier option than cooperating, unless nobody finds out. If you're really confident that nobody can ever find out, in other words, your reputation isn't on the line, then there's no gamble with defection. But you gamble with your reputation by defecting in a scenario where people can find out about it. So based on very similar logic to what I've been presenting, the prediction is that public defection is going to correlate with other manifestations of risk-taking, and private less so or not at all. And here, instead of the broad swath DOSBERT, we just did two narrow and targeted risk-taking measures, which was a design mistake in retrospect. This was a few years ago. But we did one. This is a very common risk-taking measure. It's called the BART, the Balloon Analog Risk Task. And basically the idea is you sit there and you just keep clicking a pump button. Every time you click it, your earnings increase. But every time you click it, there's a small probability that the balloon pops and you lose all your money for the trial. So the average number of clicks in your non-pop trials is the risk measure. The more you keep clicking, the riskier it is. Whether or not that's great is up for debate, but this has been associated with a lot of real-world risky behaviors, mostly in that generality of deviance cluster of behaviors. Then also just kind of a pure financial gamble. We got it from something that Dan did a long time ago. You know, would you prefer a certain $3 or a 10% chance at $30? Sorry for the big blast wall of text here, but previous investigations of, you know, how does risk-taking factor into prisoner's dilemma decision? Mostly people are only focusing on the payoffs of one prisoner's dilemma game, and then they're trying to like add up the options and tell you which is higher variance. That's how this has been approached. The problem is that it's not at all clear that economic games that are one-shot in the lab actually tap into any kind of evolved one-shot human psychology. That's far from clear. And so some people looking at prisoner's dilemma games have explicitly noted that whether cooperate or defect is a risky decision depends on what kind of environment you're in. It depends on whether one game affects the outcome of the next. So we've gotten that far, but we haven't quite gotten to like psychological risk profiling and how that relates to actual decisions. And certainly nobody has been thinking about the decisions in terms of whether the game is public or not. There is some evidence that future discounting is associated with prisoner's dilemma defection, which is in the direction of what we're thinking of here. Anyway, to skip to the results, I did a bunch of prisoner's dilemma game studies throughout my PhD work for a variety of reasons, but a lot of them had either a public or private setting, and a lot of them had those risk measures that I alluded to going along with it. And what we're seeing is that when the game looked to the participants like it was public, we're generally seeing positive relationships between defection and those risk measures that I told you about. These look like positive relationships, big confidence intervals, so I'm not sure about it. But then when the games were in private scenarios, the relationship between defection and these other risk measures looks to really just be at zero, and it looks like there's nothing there. So we think what's going on here is, you know, betting one's reputation, that you know, public defection is risky, you're betting your reputation, and that tags along, generally speaking, with other forms of risk-taking. So just to sum up everything, the big point here, I think, is just taking a very broad and functional view of risk-taking is useful for cleaning up you know, confusing trends in literature, for explaining and predicting individual differences in who takes risks and why. There's some like intuitive, nice logic to this ability-based pathway, need-based pathway, and thinking is that this can guide our study of the psychological mechanisms that execute the functional logic that I've talked about. And you know, this can extend arguably even into, you know, plants have to decide which way to grow, presumably based on some kind of input. So perhaps even non-neural decision makings can be thought of with this kind of functional logic. Thank you. I'm sure that'll be at least. Clark.
Hi, Dan. So I was thinking about the sex differences stuff, and I was thinking about the difference between average and variance, because and just the sort of theoretic predictions you're making, because you made some interesting points about the female disgust, that there were a lot of cases where you would expect from evidence and theory that it should be facultatively adjusting, and that's a reason not to expect a net sex difference. Right? So you said, mentioning Dan's work, if you can adjust this on a week-to-week basis, why would there be an overall sex difference? And so I was thinking that on the other side of thinking about the male sex differences, right? Because the logic of why men are, if I get it right, the logic of why men are more risk-taking has to do with what could be gained, not what actually is gained on average. from this risk taking, right? So,
Yeah.
right. So do you see where I'm going with this? So if you think about it in terms of expected value, any risky act, if I lose one reproduction from that, the expected value of that is the same to men and women, on average, right? Because men and women have the same amount of reproduction.
Losing one prospectively, okay, yeah.
Just I lost a reproductive opportunity. The value of that is the same to men and women on average, right?
No.
Because men and women reproduce the same amount.
No, because the range of the potential number of offspring is far greater for women than for men
But the
than it
average
is for
effect on
women.
fitness in a population, so think about a mechanism that says I do behavior A or B, right? And if the or whatever, I do the risky or non-risky thing. If I lose one reproduction, on average, the cost of that across men and women is the same. So if you did an evolutionary model that said, should this trait that either makes you do something that wins or loses a unit of reproduction spread or not, the fitness impact of that decision is the same on average across men and women. I might be mistaken about that, but I think that's true. So I think what you're talking about is actually, you're talking about, what the interesting question is here has to do with the added nuance of risk sensitivity theory that you mentioned, which is how far you are from your, one way of thinking about it is how far you are from, say, failing to reproduce altogether, or winning the reproductive jackpot of being a really successful one, right? So where I'm going with this is something like, wouldn't you expect these sex differences might take a more nuanced form where, for the men, your decisions about whether to do something risky or not should be a function of both how far, your own quality, right? And so if you don't know what I'm getting at is it seems like if you don't know your quality or if you have no cues to your quality, that pushes in the direction of lower sex differences. You need more like males and females being more similar. And it has to do with the payoff function to the risks, right? Because you mentioned two kinds of risk. You mentioned a case where the sort of drop dead if you don't do it risk, right? Which explains I do risky financial stuff when I'm about to go broke, right? And certainly that could explain some risky behavior of men if they are at risk of being the so-called losers in the mating lottery, right?
Yeah.
But then there's that other component. You would expect that those kinds of risks will be less taken by males that are on the high end of the quality spectrum, right? Like foolish risks that could result in, you see what I'm saying? But if there's another kind of risk that's like, I can afford the cost of taking this risk because I'm high quality, like the turtle example or something like that. Men on the high end of the spectrum should be doing that. But it seems to me that if on an expected value account, where those are both black boxes and the agent knows nothing about either one of those things, I actually don't see the logic of the sex difference.
So to some extent, I think we're off trying to do the math modeling and verbal reasoning right now,
yes,
trying to
absolutely.
track all the.
I haven't thought through this.
And so so I think this is a matter of carefully sitting down and determining what our parameters are and what our assumptions about them are and seeing if it checks out. I will say this, something I should have presented but forgot to add is that the correlations between risk-taking and disgust that I mentioned, the same basic pattern holds true for both men and women. So within the two sexes, the riskiest behavioral men and women are also the least disgust-prone men and women, which suggests that at least some of the basic functional logic of contingent risk-taking is operating the same within the two sexes. Another piece of this that I didn't quite delve into is I defined risk as outcome variance, and I left the currency unspecified. And you might want to think and go right to, well, fitness is the currency. But, humans, we probably make all of our decisions based on approximate psychology that is targeted at proxies of fitness, not at fitness itself. And so probably the better definition to work with is outcome variance in proxies of fitness. And so then part of what you're starting to get at is there's a nonlinear relationship between, say, calories and how those translate into fitness. And so these needs and disparities aren't linear functions of that. And so need is partially about a portion in the curve translating approximately into fitness where it's nonlinear and something jumps. And I think that this is part of what we're dancing around talking about, but I don't think I can trace through the logic of what you're talking about and give you the answer more than this general stuff. Yeah, Dan.
So I think they're both interestingly right and interestingly wrong things in what Clark said. I think that the premise that you began with is mistaken, because the reproductive potential of the two sexes is substantially different in terms of the limit, and by virtue of that, the utility of any either existing offspring or act that could lead to offspring is going to differ across the two of them. And by way of intuition, you can think about how, suppose that you have a high variance behavior that your child could engage in, right? So if they run across the freeway successfully, they get a college scholarship, right? Lots of variance there, right? Are men and women going to urge their offspring in the same way, right, to pursue that opportunity? One would predict that the answer is going to be no, because each existing child is a larger fraction of a woman's total reproductive potential than it is of a man's. So while on average it has to be the case that the average number of offspring per individual is the same for men and women, because it's only through heterosexual interaction that the children are produced, right? That doesn't mean that the meaning of each reproductive act is going to be the same for the two. That said, let me turn to the...
But can I just...
Sure.
Sorry, I don't want to necessarily have this debate in public, but I think it would depend on how you made an evolutionary model of that, because what's competing in an evolutionary model is the effects of the strategies on actual fitness, not on something that could happen. Right? So the fact that, the currency is not potential, the currency is actual babies, right? So on the logic of that model, I could see how you could have a situation that would work, but it would mean that on average, if a male loses, so again, we're talking on average, on average, if a male loses an offspring, that man is actually able to make another offspring more easily, and actually does make another offspring more easily than a woman does, on average, across all situations. And that's the part I'm not sure why you'd expect that to be true.
Because
he has to find another mate and make another offspring if he loses that baby that runs across the road.
Can't men convert?
I think you're both right. I think that because I think that the if you're talking about the loss of an existing offspring, then I think you're right. But I think if it's a reproductive opportunity is the outcome, then the potential matters. And I think most of these things speak more to the reproductive opportunity, like the actual way that these...
But preventing a child from crossing the road is about losing a child that you already
Yes,
have.
that's right. His example is about what you're talking about.
Okay.
But I think that most of these things are talking about things that tap more into potential than actual loss of an...
There's also a temporal component to it because of the female ceiling of reproductive span that you don't really have with men. So it's not going to be, I think, the same cost-benefit calculation depending on the,
Well, that gets into age structure and demography, right? That if the individual risk. But.
So Adam began with Martin and Margot's work on the young male syndrome, and the argument there is entirely about potential, right? That men are playing a higher stakes game than women are, because the difference between winning and losing is much greater. So it is about potential, and the argument with regard to why the young men are taking all of these risks, violent or otherwise, is because status will translate into opportunity that will translate into offspring at some point in the future. So it is only about potential. So maybe my example was a bad one given this, right? Because you're right that, in a largely monogamous population, the child on the freeway should be worth the same to the man. But the second thing that you said, which I want to turn to very briefly because I think it's an interesting one, is is the question of the relationship between quality and some of these things. So in a lot of these rather, I mean, if you look closely, you'll see that Adam cited a lot of my work, and a lot of his citations were, and this is wrong, right? That is, the things that I rather informally suggested in previous publications that seem not to hold up to higher scrutiny. But one of the possibilities is that that voluntary male risk-taking includes exposure to pathogens, and it can either be an honest signal of quality, or it can be a crazy bastard signal of indifference to risk, right? And it's hard to differentiate between those two. But, so on about decadal cycles, university fraternities reinvent goldfish swallowing competitions, and universities ban them as inhumane, and then they surface again. And the kind of fear factor strategy of, publicly demonstrating indifference to the cost of exposure to pathogens is explicable entirely in terms of some kind of quality signaling thing. And that should be true across men and women. Right?
Yep.
So I have two quick points. I'll try to couple them. So one is also about the sex differences, although I have a kind of different spin on it, which is, I appreciate that you were looking for a publication bias and didn't seem to find one that makes good sense to me. There are two other kinds of biases that I wonder might be playing a role. So one is a sample bias. So my guess is that most of these are weird samples, and I just am curious to know whether if you went to other places, if you would see the same sex difference in these kinds of disgust biases.
Yeah, so it's largely a matter of speculation. The vast majority of the sample are weird. That said, there is quite a lot of diversity within the weird world that is in that sample.
So that might get to my
Can I
second.
say something about that too, which is that if the first hypothesis that was proposed is a pregnancy disgust hypothesis, and you're looking at a weird sample population where a huge number of people are going to be using hormonal contraception which mimics pregnancy, there is the possibility that this is a pregnancy effect that is just expanded to the vast majority of the general sample of women.
So addressing that concern, we talk about this exact concern in the paper, that the populations of students, they tend not to be pregnant, they tend to be on the
Yeah, that's a
birth
different point than the
control.
one that Molly, so the one that Molly's making, I mean, I take issue with your premise that hormonal contraceptives mimic pregnancy. I think this is a popular conception that's in
I know,
in
and that they don't
literature, but
in most ways, but if you have a black box mechanism here, then we don't know what aspect of pregnancy physiology signals the brain in a way that alters risk
yeah,
propensity.
all of that is conceivable. I mean, by way of, I think responding to Brooke, we can say, so there is a lot of cross-cultural material in the meta-analysis data set. It is mostly still quasi-weird in the sense that they're, across, the affluent sector of 40-odd societies or something like that.
That gets to-
Ethnographically, and we cite this as anecdotal evidence for what it's worth. I mean, so I spent 3 years in Bengkulu, high pathogen load, minimal access to medical care. Exactly the same difference was clearly evident there. So I'm if I had to bet, I would bet that it's not an artifact of the sample. But
That's fine. I mean, I was just asking, and the second point I was trying to make related to that, before I get to my second question, was that that this could also be a cultural bias in that even if these are sort of weird, non-weird samples, and then it's like Brazilian college students or something like that, that if there are strong cultural norms about women having to be prim and proper and being more likely to say that they're disgusted by things, and how much you're tapping into those cultural norms as opposed to some deeper psychological mechanism, I think maybe still unresolved.
Yeah, and the only way that we've been able to address that concern is by acknowledging it and by saying it seems to us that these cultural phenomenon that you describe are more likely to elaborate on a difference that already is there than to make up an entirely new one, but
Yeah, maybe.
we're waving our hands, right?
My second point is maybe more of a semantic one, but so I take a little bit of issue with equating or making the costly signaling idea akin to these ideas about risk, and it's partly because of the way you, this is where I say it's maybe more of a semantic issue, but when you're thinking about these ability-based risks, right, where the payoffs differ according to your ability, right? So if you're higher ability, there's a greater likelihood of a payoff. But doesn't that, in fact, what that does is reduce the variance for you, right? So even though the activity, oh wait, I had one other thing about the other point, sorry. So basically, just if you're reducing the variance, then it may be that the activity overall is risky, but that actually it's not that risky for those high ability people, which is I think part of what you were saying. So this is why I think it's more of a semantic thing. But before you say that, before I lose my head, I'm sorry. I think the other thing maybe that this is different, that the domain, there's a bias in the domains of risk that people have looked at. So if you look at all the examples from your talk today, they're pretty male biased in terms of the types of, who tends to do these activities and things like that.
Yeah.
And there may be more understudied areas of risk that women take. You can think about weaning time, birth intervals, risks associated with pregnancy. There's a whole suite of things I think we could social risks, things like that are just understudied. And so to this, I think it's not that you're making this conclusion, but I think it's premature to say that men are just more risk prone than women, because I think that this really might be a bias of what areas of risk we've looked at.
Yeah, very sensible. I take your point, and very minorly supportive of your point. So the Dosford instrument, flawed though I think it may be, one of the domains, there's a social risk-taking domain and there's an ethical risk-taking domain, and I forget which one, but one of them is the only one where you typically don't see this sex difference that you see in all of the other domains. So yes, the typical, maybe the male risk-taking behaviors, I'm still kind of extending out from the deviant type risk-taking model and still thinking in some biased way. And that way I think that's totally possible. And you're right, there are some kinds of, certain kinds of reproductive decision-making might have more variance associated with than others. Yeah, we should talk more about that. Because maybe the modeling can somehow consider that.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether overall, you would come up with a very different looking model for women versus men, but it was more just an observation when all the examples kept coming up with thinking I might not want to jump out of a plane, but there are other things that I might do that might be better.
The trouble is that if you choose an activity like, birth interval or weaning duration or something like that, nursing duration, something like that, since only women can engage in the activity, all that men can do is urge women to make different decisions, and there are conflicts of interest that are entirely separate from risk propensities that have to do with residual reproductive potential. So the two may disagree for reasons other than differences in risk preference.
They might, but I think that if you go the other way and you pick activities that are done 90% of the time by men, then it may be almost as good as taking something like weaning that's a solely female activity. I mean, I think that there's still some narrowness to thinking about the domains of risk that has been really male biased.
So, one of the ways that Martin and Margot address that is by looking at firearm-related homicides, because you don't need to be big and strong to kill someone with a gun. It doesn't substantially change the sex difference in involvement in violence when you look at firearms.
And just to go back and root it in.
Violence is the male domain. I think you can put violence into the male domain. Like the fact that you're looking at violence, whether it's gun violence or some other kind of violence. I think you're still thinking about a domain that's where risk taking is largely a male activity, and then maybe other domains where maybe social things where the risk taking is more, you see more risk taking among women.
I think you presuppose the question that way, but we should let other people speak.
Andrew.
So I know you sort of explicitly de-emphasized your focus on moral disgust, but I'd like to. So on the slide that you had with the sort of the different bar graphs, it seemed that the variance for male disgust and deception and the other thing was way, way higher than the variance in the female response. And I was wondering just if you could speak to the distribution of what is this one? I think it's further back.
Are you talking about all of the disgust effects that I put up? That didn't have any sense.
You had one that was like 3 bar graphs.
That was another.
Yeah, okay.
This is condemnation, not disgust. This
Right,
is just
okay.
some other project where I was looking at condemnation and I noticed the sex difference.
And this, I mean, this is like a proxy for moral disgust, right?
I'm only putting it up there to show that, look, I found this sex difference in moral disgust. I'm not going to thoroughly try to dig into what it means, but hey, I found sex differences in moral phenomena
Right.
before. There's
Okay.
probably something to it.
Yeah, so what I wanted to ask them is, bracketing all that and assuming that this is sort of tapping into something about moral disgust, do you have any hypotheses as to what's explaining the difference in variance? Like, is this in virtue of, say...
Sample size. That's
That's
pure
just sample size?
Yep. There are fewer men in this study than women. That's all it is.
Okay, so you don't think it's mapping onto, like, differences in mating strategies such that a high investing male strategy is more likely to mirror disgust domains that you see in a,
I mean, one of these sexually dimorphic features of humanity seems to be that men have more variance in a lot of traits than do women. So maybe it seems reasonable to think that that would apply to moral judgments too, more variance in the male response than women. But I don't have any strong predictions.